I've scoured the internet for all of the best routing and mixing strategies to ensure that I've made a template that allows me to work in the most optimal fashion. If you're curious about how to get your ideas on the page more quickly, how to route your instruments in the most professional and clean manner, or just to create your own template, then you've come to the right place. And of course, if you don't have the patience or time to follow any of this, then just hop over to the Patreon where you can download everything covered in the episode. Let's dive into it. This video is sponsored by DistroKid, and I'll have more about them at the end of the video. That's my lunch. So I've shown this template off in a couple of episodes now, and some of you have been asking for a walkthrough of everything that is on screen. So consider this the MTV Cribs of Ableton. This is where the magic happens. All right, so we're going to start off with how I arrange my page, move through the tracks to the routing before finally meeting the pre-master, master, and any other exciting doohickeys that I have around the edge of the screen. So grab something to write on and let's start with the tempo. I've set my tempo at 140. There's a reason for this. I compose a lot of sleepy music at 70 BPM and make a lot of UK bass at 140. Even though this can change from time to time, it helps to know that this is my most common BPM. You'll find out through this episode that a lot of these tools are just one-click adjustments, but they all come together to save you time in the long run. From here, I set up my markers. I've got my intro, main loop, main with energy, break, build, main 2, and the outro. This falls at 1 minute. It's not long enough to create a whole tune, but what it does allow me to do is create all of my main sections to create enough of a narrative that I can then go on to expand and fill in the gaps afterwards. And when I laid out these markers, I used a reference track, which made me add this reference track. We're going to come back to the specific routing of this track because it bypasses all of the other rules of the template. But moving on, and just for me, I have an SC sender. This might not be applicable to everyone, but it's essentially a sidechain sender. I use a lot of shapers, but sometimes just go with the old-fashioned kick sidechain. So I've set up a track so I can drop my kicks in straight away. Again, just saving a little bit of time. And from there, with the same rule, is my resample group. From here, I have a resample track because I do a lot of resampling. Don't want to continuously create a new audio track, find resampling and resample the track. So this is ready to go, record arm, but I've just set it into bypass mode when I don't need it. So it's not always listening and taking up CPU. You can see that my CPU is currently very low right now. By the way, if you do want to add an emoji to your tracks, it's really easy. I keep these emojis on the group headers for the most part, just so they're easier to see with like dyslexia and everything. But if you want to add your own, just come to rename, and then I choose Control, Command, and Space, and that brings up the emojis that I want to use. Under the resample track, I've also got a granulator because it helps to know that throughout all of these episodes that I've recorded, I often like using the granulator. So I've thrown that underneath from the get-go. And here's where we come to my first go-to effects rack. In every track, you'll find my go-to effects rack, which is set to bypass for the most part. So again, it doesn't use up too much CPU. In that go-to effects rack, I have a glue compressor, an EQ8, OTT, utility, and the compressor. OTT, by the way, is the free extra OTT, which you can find in the description below. These are the most common tools that I use on most tracks. So I've set these up ahead of time, and you might have seen this in my previous episode, which is the workflow hacks episode. I'll link it in the top right if you haven't checked that out. With the EQ8, I've already got my roll off set, and then these two nodes, because I'm normally scooping out this frequency and boosting this frequency there or thereabout. So these are all set up, ready to go, starting with my EQ8. And then I've saved this as my go-to effects rack. To save your own effects rack, you just come down to the floppy disk icon and then save that effects rack. If you want to save it on every audio or MIDI track, then you just right-click that particular track and then save as default MIDI track. Then you'll need to do the same for an audio track as well. If you think this video is going to be helpful, by the way, do make sure you hit that magic button so you can see more like it in the future, and it greatly helps out the channel. Moving on from this, I've got my main group. The main group is for your lead melody, vocals, or whatever's going to be your main instrument. So I've put my sampler in here as well because I often start with a sampled melody or chord pattern, but if not, I can throw my vocal audio in there, or my lead MIDI instrument. I'm going to move more quickly through the tracks now, as you often see that there's a MIDI and an audio track set up in each group, just so I can jump to getting the idea down even quicker. Now you may have noticed when I opened this template, it was already highlighted with the scalar track. And this is because I often choose my key through scalar and maybe get a rough chord progression in. So scalar is one of the few instruments that is already loaded in this template, for me at least. It won't be in the Patreon version because you might not have scalar, and I very much want you to choose your own instruments. It's going to get you working to your strengths and not trying to follow in my footsteps. So scalar's already set up and record armed with the track off of bypass. Then I've got my chords track and my MIDI underneath. For bass, I've set up Sublab, an 808 track, which is just an audio track, and my Ample Sound P-Bass track. I often use Sublab or Ample Sound if I'm not using a sample track, so they're all ready to go as well because I'm rarely going to use anything else. I've got a kick and snare group set up next with a kick audio track and a snare audio track set up. You can see that these already have specific roll-offs as well as the go-to effects rack. And this is because these are those click and repeat things that I do in every project. So let's just get our kicks and snares in mono from the get-go, shall we? And then I have a drum rack for any other drums that I want to use in the kick and snare track for layers. So from here I have the top drums group. This is for any cymbal, percussion, or higher ear candy stuff. You can see here that I already have a roll-off and an align delay in the drum group itself, and that's because I often set my sounds to be a little bit wider than those kicks, snares, hats, and toms that will be very central. And then finally, of the instruments, I have an effects group. This is an empty audio track with the group titled Effects with a limiter and an align delay. Once again, this is for any atmospheric sounds, sweeps, swooshes, and impact sounds. So now we've hot stepped it through there, it comes to the chains. Now the chains is something that a lot of us YouTube producers scoured from a famous Skrillex video where he showed off his Ableton template. It's one of those things that is extremely obvious once you know the information, but until you saw it, you didn't think to do it in your own project. This is the act of setting up various limiters, which are their own tracks where your instruments will be sent to have their own independent limiting done to ensure that everything goes to the pre-master or master track cleanly, rather than just having one limiter at your final track, which is probably going to capture your loudest instrument or the loudest frequency, which will have an effect on your overall mix. Makes sense, right? So from here, we've got our chain group, and inside that we have a sub limiter, which our basses will be sent to, and I'll show you how to do that in just a sec. That has a limiter, a color limiter on, which is free. You can download it from the Ableton website over at PAX. This adds just a little bit of saturation to your limiting, which can introduce extra harmonics, which can give the feeling like there's a little bit more loudness. And with something like bass, that can be extremely helpful. I also have Waves R bass set up, which I've mentioned before is worth its weight in gold. It's one of the best Waves products in my opinion. It can really help pull your sound out of small speakers like phones and laptops. And then an EQ8 ready to go with that roll off there. You can see my nodes look a little bit different here because I often set up an envelope follower, which might end up ducking the frequency of a particular dynamic. I then have a basic limiter, which is where most of my instruments are going to get sent to. A top limiter for all of my top drums, hi-hat, more trebly based sounds. You can see that this EQ8 is set to the mid-side mode to ensure that I don't have too much treble or bass way out at the sides of my mix. And then finally, I have a blank limiter, which is where I'm going to send like kind of main chord progressions, things that I don't want to have any effects. So a vocal would go to my blank limiter. I don't want to be cutting off any lows or any highs, at least at the start of making my piece of music. And then the chain capture to capture all of these limiters and send them out to the pre-master. Now, before we get to the pre-master, how do I set up my limiters? So I just go up to my groups, and instead of selecting external out or to the master track, I just select that particular limiter. So for the main, it was the blank limiter. Chords was the basic limiter. Bass was of course the sub limiter. Kick and snare is also going to the blank limiter because I'm normally going to EQ those things respectively. Top drums to of course the top limiter, and my effects to the top limiter as well. These limiters are just audio tracks in their own group, which are set at no input and in, and are being sent to the chain capture. Each of these devices are being sent to this chain capture, which is the last audio group. And then the chain group is being sent to the pre-master. Again, pre-master set to no input and in. Oh, I did mention that the reference track is set to its own routing. This you're just going to keep a standard set to the master output with the master at the bottom here. This ensures that it doesn't go through your pre-master track, which is only going to make that reference track even louder. So coming to the end, on my pre-master, I have my Route 23 kind of master chain template. This is a group of plugins that I'm most commonly going to use on my pre-master track to ensure that when I send demos out or pre-mastered tracks, they sound pretty loud and pretty clean from the get-go. They only need final tweaks and adjustments in the mastering process. I've saved this chain group the same as I save everything else. Save as default preset or come over here to the little floppy disk icon. It starts off with a utility checker. First a mono check, then a mid-side check. This is in its own group. That's switched on, and when I switch on the mono check, it's going to put all of my music into mono. With the MS checker, it allows me to see if there's any kind of phase issues happening within my mix. I can move on to my first EQ. By this point, I've probably EQ'd most instruments, so I normally add a little dip on the high shelf or maybe a little dip on the low shelf here, but occasionally I'll scoop out some frequencies. I come over to my first glue compression here, which is just a low attack and a very, very low release. And that allows me to, of course, have a little bit more of an even dynamic across the whole of my track. Then I've got this D-Mud preset here, which of course has its EQ settings set to the bandpass mode. And what I'm doing here is capturing some of those lower, muddier frequencies and just trying to squash them a little bit. All of the things that overlap in all of your tracks to create that kind of muddy hum. I want to reduce that if I can, and that is the job of the D-Mud preset. As we move on, I use Gullfoss often. Some of you use Soothe, and Gullfoss is very much the same. It just helps reduce some of those muddy frequencies and add a little bit of brightness to your track. But you can also use multiband compression or OTT, then some final EQ8 here. Just one node at the end here because I'm normally just reducing one frequency. It needs to be linear, subtractive EQ. At this stage in your template, you shouldn't be adding any frequencies. That should have been taken care of prior in your above tracks. Finally, I'm met with a color limiter and then a limiter. I apologize because I forget where I got this tip. I think it might have been Seed to Stage that showed us the benefit of using two limiters together. Saturation or color limiter, as I explained earlier, can help boost an extra bit of loudness before your final limiter. So sometimes I'll increase the loudness of the color limiter and maybe introduce a little bit of saturation and then use the final limiter with different ceiling, look ahead and release settings to increase hopefully the overall loudness. And that is my pre-master chain. As we move down, we have A-Verb, which is just my favorite Valhalla Vintage Verb preset, and then B-Verb main, which is the same preset with a compressor after. If you've ever had a Patreon one-to-one session with me, you've probably heard me talk about side chaining your reverb. Oftentimes when you've got something like a lead vocal that you add reverb to, it gets a little bit muddy because that reverb is drifting over the vocal. So what you want to do is have a sidechain compressor set up to listen to the track itself, and anytime that vocal plays, there won't be any sidechain, but in any space there will be reverb. It's a great trick to use with delay as well. After this, I have my master track, which you can see has a final limiter on it. This is more so for the reference track in case that is exceptionally loud. And then I have Spectrum set up and this cool Pomodoro timer, which is the thing that you see floating up here in this space. This is actually the only space that I could find for the timer to sit, so I often put it here where it's not going to be covering up any tools. This is something that I found on Patches Gumroad, which you can download for free, but it's pay what you want, so I would suggest supporting other creators. It's an exceptional tool which basically just starts your Pomodoro technique timer, which I use often in my live streams and when I'm working on my own projects to make sure that I don't become stagnant in the nitty-gritty. This will count down from 30 or whatever you've set your timer settings to, and then when it hits pause, you'll hear a little ding and it will actually pause your overall music. You then have a 5-minute break where you can focus on something else, drink some water, stretch, and then when that timer goes off again, you're ready to start your next 30 minutes inside the template. And after it goes off a couple of times, you get a longer break. So this is super helpful and very in keeping with the Pomodoro technique. You can see that all of my groups are set to -10 to ensure that all of my tracks are coming in with plenty of headroom, so I'm not starting with a 0-0 kick, which is already the loudest thing in my mix. It's going to mean that your music starts a little bit quieter, but as you add instruments, you should have a more even spread, which doesn't hit the limiter straight away and still allows for a little bit of headroom so you can bring it up in the master. If you're not making your own, then this template is available at the Patreon, just without the specific instruments or the granulator, because you might not have that in your own template. And as I said, it's important to set up your own tools that you most commonly use. If you want to save your own template, then just come to the top left of the screen and select Save Live Set as Template. When you do so, it's going to save that in User Library first and then Templates. And then you can choose to save that template and it will be right here in Templates. A lot of my templates I make sure are blue because some of these are Ableton presets, so I make sure all of my presets are up here in groups. If you want to see more that maybe I glossed over in this video, it's probably because it was featured in my workspace video, which again you should check out after this video. I hope that was helpful, guys. As always, thank you so much for swinging by. Let me know what you want to see in future videos, and I'll catch you next time. At the beginning of this video, I told you we were sponsored by DistroKid, and it's true. I release all of my music with DistroKid. With the help of their splits functions, Mixio, their promo tools, it makes it so easy to get your music on over 200 platforms. If you want to get 7% off your first year, just use the link in the description below. Thanks, DistroKid. Thank you, person watching this until the end of the video.